Welcome to episode 152 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It's April 1st, 1928. We're in Lisbon at the Estadio do Lumiar, and today's story is about a 0-0 that mattered far more than 0-0s usually do, because on this day in 1928, Argentina drew with Portugal in Lisbon in its first ever international outside South America. No goals, missed penalties, a slightly undercooked performance after a long Atlantic journey. And yet, this was a hinge moment, because this was the afternoon Argentina stepped out of the closed circuit of Rio de la Plata football and onto the wider international stage. A week later, they would beat Atletico Madrid. A few weeks later, they would go to Amsterdam. And soon after that, they would reach an Olympic final against Uruguay, lose it, and deepen one of the great rivalries in the history of the sport. So this is not only a story about a scoreless draw, it's a story about a rival, about timing, about how in the 1920s, world football was still being invented, and how Uruguay got there just a little earlier than Argentina. Now, how did we get here? Argentine football begins, like so many football stories outside Britain, in ports, railways, schools, and expatriate communities. The game arrived in Buenos Aires with the British world, merchants, engineers, railwaymen, teachers, and schoolmasters. In 1867, Thomas and James Hawke helped organize what is generally treated as the first recorded football match in Argentina. That matters because from the beginning, the sport in Argentina was not just a pastime. It had institutions, organizers, and people trying to turn ball into habit. Then came the real great builder, Alexander Watson Hutton, the Scottish schoolmaster who arrived in the 1880s, taught sport with missionary intensity, founded English High School, and helped create the environment from which alumni would emerge, the club that became the great emblem of Argentina's early football age. Around that world, clubs like Lomas, Belgrano Athletic, Quilmes, and others helped turn the game from a British enclave into a wider social force. And by 1893, the administrative structure was there too. Watson Hutton and the clubmen around him founded the Argentine Association Football League. That is crucial, because Argentina didn't simply discover football, it organized football, and early, decisively, and before most of the world had done the same. Then came the national team, and here another early figure matters. James Oswald Anderson, player, organizer, early captain, and pioneer. When Argentina played Uruguay in Montevideo in 1902, and won 6-0. It was the first official international for both nations. That was the beginning of something much larger than one result, because the Rio de la Plata was not a barrier, it was a football corridor. The steamers crossed, players crossed, ideas crossed, and Argentina and Uruguay kept playing each other. Lipton Cup, Newton Cup, South American Championship, friendly after friendly, cup after cup, argument after argument. Long before the World Cup, these two countries were building one another through repetition. They were neighbors, mirrors, irritants, and measuring sticks. That is one of the great secrets of early South American football. Argentina and Uruguay did not rise in isolation. They sharpened each other. Now put that inside the wider world of the 1920s. There's still no World Cup. Jules Rimet has become FIFA president in 1921. We talked about that in episode 121. And he's already thinking bigger than the Olympic framework. But the Olympics still matter enormously. In fact, they matter almost too much, because before FIFA has its own World Championship, Olympic football is the closest thing the sport has to a truly global public stage. By 1914, FIFA had effectively accepted Olympic football as a World Championship for amateurs. And that phrase matters, for amateurs, because football, especially in the Rio de la Plata, is already pushing hard against that category. The game is getting better. Crowds are growing. Money is circling. And amateurism is increasingly a moral label stretched over a semi-professional reality. And that tension sits behind almost everything in this era. Which brings us to 1924. And here's the key point. Argentina didn't miss the Paris Olympics because it lacked players. It missed them because its football authorities could not get out of their own way. The official Asociación Argentina de Fútbol, the rival Asociación Amateurs de Football, the Comité Olímpico Argentina, and the broader sports authorities all became entangled in a power struggle over who had the right to select, recognize, and send the team. The deadline came, the quarrels continued, the train left, and Argentina stayed home. But Uruguay went, and that changed everything. In Paris in 1924, Uruguay didn't merely win Olympic gold. No, Uruguay detonated in Europe. Their football looked different, faster in thought, cleaner in execution, more modern than many Europeans expected from South America. And suddenly, Uruguay were not just a strong South American side. They were world champions in everything but name. And that was the gap. Not an enormous gap in football quality, but a gap in symbolic capital, a gap in visibility, a gap in timing. Even Jules Rimet publicly lamented Argentina's absence and made clear he hoped that they would be present at the next Olympic Games. Everyone in Buenos Aires understood the message. So what happens next is telling. The split inside Argentine football could not continue forever. The embarrassment of missing Paris mattered. Uruguay's triumph mattered. And by late 1926, after years of conflict, the rival Argentine associations were finally brought back together. Even politics had to lean on football to make that happen. Only then did Argentina have the institutional coherence needed to answer Uruguay on the world stage. And answer they did. They won the South American Championship in 1927. They built a squad good enough to travel. And in 1928, for the first time, Argentina committed to the Olympic football tournament. That is how we reached Lisbon on April 1st, 1928, Estadio do Lumiar, about 20,000 spectators, Portugal versus Argentina. José Lago Millan is the Argentine coach. The team includes names that would define the era: Octavio Diaz in goal, Bidoglio and Paternoster in defense, Orlandini in midfield, and up front, men like Perinetti, Ochoa, Cerro, Tarasconi, and Orsi. Portugal, meanwhile, have their own pride at stake, at home, in front of a curious public, facing a South American side Europeans had heard about far more than they had actually seen. Argentina was simply better. They had more of the ball, more of the attacking initiative, and more of the sharper technical moments. But they lacked finish. They missed chances. They missed penalties. At least 2, and perhaps 3, depending on which record you trust. And that detail is too good to leave out. Argentina's first international outside South America, and they spent part of it firing from 12 yards and still failing to score. Portugal's goalkeeper Roquetti was central to that, and the home side, to their credit, defended with seriousness and discipline. Portuguese press at the time reacted with respect, slightly surprise, and a little protective of national pride. The draw was framed as an honourable result for Portugal. The home defence was praised. Several individual performances were singled out. But there was also an important caveat. The Argentines had only just arrived in Europe after the long voyage, and perhaps should not yet be judged at full operating level. That is a very sharp observation. It says that Portuguese papers understood both sides of the story. Yes, Portugal had done well. But yes, this might also be a first glimpse of the visitors. And that is exactly what Lisbon turned out to be, a first glimpse. So what? In the immediate sense, that 0-0 itself was only a prelude. Once the Olympic tournament began, Argentina erupted. They beat the United States 11-2, then Belgium 6-3, then Egypt 6-0. Domingo Tarasconi scored 11 goals in the tournament, a men's Olympic football record that still stands to this day. So whatever Lisbon had concealed, Amsterdam revealed. And then came the final, Argentina versus Uruguay. Of course it did. The first match ended 1-1, even after extra time, so there had to be a replay. And in the replay, Uruguay won, 2-1. There's something almost cruelly perfect about that. Argentina finally arrived. Argentina finally crossed the ocean. And Argentina finally reached the global stage. And waiting for them, there, again, is Uruguay. Still just ahead, still collecting the biggest prize. There was an even bigger development running in parallel. During those Amsterdam days, FIFA gave the green light to Jules Rimet's World Championship project. The World Cup was now coming. And Uruguay's back-to-back Olympic triumphs gave their bid to host enormous prestige. So when the first World Cup was finally played in 1930, it went to Montevideo. And when the final came, it was Uruguay versus Argentina again, and Uruguay won again. That is the larger arc of this episode. In the early global era of football, Argentina and Uruguay moved in parallel, but Uruguay got the head start. They went to Europe first in 1924. They won Olympic gold first, and they repeated it in 1928, and then won the first World Cup in 1930. And then later, Uruguay added 1950 to the mythology. Argentina were not weak in those years, far from it. They were often brilliant. They were a continental power. They produced extraordinary players. But emotionally, narratively, and internationally, there was a period in which they kept arriving at the door just after Uruguay had already walked through it. Always the bridesmaid, never the bride? Not entirely. That is too harsh and too simple. But it does capture something of the emotional texture of the era. Now the really interesting question is whether Lisbon in 1928 changed the deeper long-term balance. And here I think the answer is not directly, but meaningfully. Not because one April friendly in Portugal transformed Argentine football on its own. That would be absurd. But because in a period when international football's hierarchy was still soft, timing mattered, visibility mattered, travel mattered, showing yourself to Europe mattered, and Argentina had lost 4 priceless years by missing Paris 1924. Eventually, though, scale told. Argentina had the larger population, the bigger club ecosystem, the deeper football economy. Later, Argentine clubs became huge continental forces in the Libertadores era, and then came Menotti in 1978, then Maradona in 1986, and, in our own time, Messi, and a new world title in 2022. Uruguay remained historic, dangerous, and gloriously stubborn, but by the late 20th century, Argentina had moved into a different global lane. Not because Uruguay disappeared, but because Argentina's structural weight finally matched its footballing imagination. Which is why Lisbon still matters, because it is the first public scene in that longer outward journey, the first time the Albiceleste stepped beyond South America and said, "Here we are." Before we go, 3 things to take away from April 1st, 1928. First, this was more than a scoreless friendly. It was Argentina's passport stamp into global football. Second, Argentina missed Paris 1924 less because of football weakness than because of administrative weakness. The players were there, but the institutions failed them. And third, Uruguay's early edge over Argentina was not huge in calendar time, just 4 years. But in a formative era, 4 years could mean Olympic gold, European prestige, and a first claim on world leadership. On this day in 1928, Argentina drew 0-0 with Portugal in Lisbon in its first international outside South America, a modest result that opened the road to Olympic silver, to an even fiercer rivalry with Uruguay, and to Argentina's long emergence from regional power into one of football's enduring global giants. That's all for episode 152 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the show, leave a 5-star rating, and share it with all your friends. Tomorrow, we go to England and to April 2nd, 1915, when football and gambling collided in the Good Friday betting scandal. See you tomorrow.